Hey everyone, how's it going? Well, it's time for my last video in my series of videos about the best books that I've read this year. And this last video is going to be on my top 6 fiction books of the year. Like I mentioned in my video on my top non-fiction reads of the year, it's been a stronger fiction year than non-fiction year. There have been more, I think, fiction books that have been truly remarkable than non-fiction books. And so, as a result, the number 1 book that I list in this video is also my book of the year. So the book of the year this year is a fiction book, last year it was a non-fiction book. And so I will cut the preamble and get into my top 6. So coming in at number 6 is a science fiction novel, Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. This takes place in a near-future dystopia in which the United States has been taken over by a strongman sort of dictator, where environmental degradation has advanced extremely far, and where race relations have deteriorated significantly so that most racial and ethnic groups do not associate with one another, and most people live in squalor, in poverty, and among a lot of crime and gang violence. And it's about a young woman named Lauren who tries to get a ragtag group of followers to the northern United States to hopefully start a new community where they can prosper and thrive, and also about her invention of this new religion that she hopes will kind of lead humanity to create a better world. And I think this novel has stuck with me so much for 2 big reasons. The first being how well realized the world is. The dystopian world in which this takes place, which you can probably tell from my description, is very close to home, feels very plausible, and is realized so vividly that it's just really stuck with me. It's a very haunting universe that Octavia Butler creates in this book. The other reason is for the character of Lauren. Octavia Butler actually said herself that she wanted Lauren to be a kind of prophet, and wanted her to be a character who, after she had died and some time had passed, people might remember her as a god. She is this charismatic and fiercely protective and intelligent person, and she's very sympathetic, but she also gets very angry. She loses her temper. She steals to survive, and she engages in sensual pleasures as well in this book. And so she's not perfect, but she is really just a fascinating, fascinating character. And so those are the 2 major reasons that I absolutely loved this book. So that's number 6. Number 5 is a book I talked about very recently on my channel. It's Unquiet by Linn Ullmann. Linn Ullmann is the daughter of the great Norwegian actress Liv Ullmann and the Swedish director Ingmar Bergman. I am a big fan of both Liv Ullmann and Ingmar Bergman, and I would not want to define Linn Ullmann by her relationship to these 2 other people. But this novel is basically a piece of autofiction about her relationship with her mother and her father. And it is such a complex and frank exploration of motherhood and fatherhood and daughterhood, and is an incredibly interesting coming-of-age story. And what I think is most powerful about it is the way that it explores grief and death. A lot of it is about Ingmar Bergman at the end of his life, and his growing dementia at the end of his life. And I think if you are someone who has lost a parent, this would be a really powerful read for you. But I also think that if you've ever had someone in your life suffer from dementia, it would be an incredibly powerful read. So this is a great novel, and that's why it's number 5. Coming in at number 4 is A Constellation of Vital Phenomena by Anthony Marra. This is a novel that takes place in Chechnya in 2004 and has a lot to do with the ongoing strife in Chechnya. And it's about a series of characters kind of tied up in that conflict. And for one thing, the writing in this book is remarkable. It has so many great descriptions, so much great imagery, so many great sentences. And another thing that's great about it is how funny it is. It is a very tragic story that you read about in the book, but there are also some incredibly funny moments, and I think it's very difficult to balance humor with a tragic story, and so that's another reason. But the last reason that I think makes it great is just the characters. Not only the main characters in this book are so well drawn and so interesting and sympathetic, and you care about them, and they're funny, you care about their relationships with each other. But what Anthony Marra does as well, so well, is he will bring in characters into the story who only appear for like a page or two, and yet somehow in that page or those 2 pages, they feel fully three-dimensional and fully alive. And so the novel, in addition to being about this small story about a few characters in this conflict, is also about everyone, in a way, about everyone involved in it, because Anthony Marra always talks about people who pass through the story but aren't necessarily deeply involved in the story. And that's what I love about it as well. So that is number 4. Coming in at number 3 is going way back in time. This is a book from the 14th century, I believe, and it is Njal Saga, which I read for Saga Long, which is an event that I host with several other booktubers where we read Icelandic sagas. And this is essentially a very long revenge story. It's basically about a long cycle of revenge, a cycle of retribution and revenge and violence that just can't ever seem to end. The book is very pessimistic about human nature because humans are portrayed as always needing vengeance and therefore always perpetuating these violent conflicts. And even when the law tries to step in to resolve the conflict, someone always sparks it again. And so it's this really pessimistic but extremely powerful just exploration of human beings' impulse toward violence toward one another, and their impulse to continue creating cycles of violence and revenge, punctuated by some moments of grace, some moments of real forgiveness and real human connection. And it's just a tremendous work. I did a series of 4 videos on it, so I'll try to remember to leave a link to those if you're interested. But it's just a tremendous classic, so I highly recommend it as my number 3 book. And then my number 2 book is also considered a classic, and it's a much bigger book, I think, than anything else on this list, and it is Middlemarch by George Eliot. Middlemarch is one of those novels like Moby Dick or like The Brothers Karamazov that seems like it's a novel that's about everything, about all of life. And it's this sprawling story about many characters, and it explores all of these characters, many of whom are extremely flawed, with a lot of sympathy and warmth. And when a novel is trying to be about everything and also portrays characters with so much warmth, that's already a great book for me. But in addition, the writing in this book is some of the best ever that I've read. There's just so much great writing in the book. So I just highly recommend it. I don't have much more to say other than that. I also made a video about Middlemarch, which I'll leave a link to. And it's not a super long video because I think it's just it's a difficult book to summarize, but it's easy for me to summarize why I love it. So my number 2 book. And then finally, my number 1 book, a book that I have talked about before but didn't do an individual video on, and my book of the year, is Oscar and Lucinda by Peter Carey. It's not very often that I read a novel and just immediately want to read all of the author's other works, but this was one of the cases where I did. And what's so interesting about this novel is that on paper, the story is not something that I should find terribly interesting. It takes place in 19th century England and Australia, so it's about a guy named Oscar and a woman named Lucinda. Oscar is English, and he's the son of an evangelical pastor who breaks from the religion of his father and decides to become an Anglican minister. And Lucinda is from Australia, and she is an heiress and inherits a lot of money and decides to start a glass business. And the novel is about the two of them meeting and starting a relationship. And the sort of climactic event of the novel is that Lucinda challenges Oscar to transport a glass church all the way from Sydney, Australia, up the coast a few hundred miles to a remote town in Australia. But it's about so much more than that. It's about Oscar and Lucinda's growing up, about their relationship with their parents, about Oscar's faith as a pastor, about Lucinda's place as a woman in society, how she struggles with gender norms of the time. It's also to a degree about colonialism and the way that civilization in Australia, white civilization, is built on the subjugation of the natives of Australia. But what's interesting about the story is that the story that I've just described to you is not a story that I would usually find terribly interesting. But what makes it interesting is that Peter Carey writes about it as though it were an epic, as though it were from an epic poem or from the King James Bible or something. He gives this small story, although it is kind of a bonkers story, he gives this small story this weight because he infuses it with all this imagery and this heightened style. One of the great aspects of this novel is the style that it's written in. There are a lot... What's great about Peter Carey's style, what's interesting about Peter Carey's style, is he contrasts really short declarative sentences with really long, flowing, meandering, run-on sentences. And he is just so playful and ingenious with his language. So many of the passages in the book I could just read aloud because they're so beautiful. They're passages that you would want to add to a commonplace book. But he just infuses this story with this epic grandeur, and I think that's why I ended up loving it. So yeah, that's my book of the year. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have read the books, let me know what you think. And here's to another good reading year in 2022. So anyway, I will talk to you all soon. Bye.